Resilience, sustainability, and adaptation in the visual arts sector often comes from the resourcefulness of thousands of artists and freelance art workers being light on their feet and responding to situations with the support of their peers. In 2020, with the pandemic and the lockdown, many people found that they couldn't keep working as they had before. They had to find ways to work differently, change direction, even start again. For many artists and freelance art workers, informal networks made all the difference. People helped each other when they otherwise felt isolated and cut off from their work. In this series, which we're calling Open Source, we're seeking to tap into that approach to address some of the big challenges we are tackling as artists and art workers of all kinds. Open source is one strand of a wider program called VisualiSE. Today, we're looking at the climate emergency, an issue that is, of course, increasingly impacting humanity and life on Earth in so many ways. The visual arts sector is not immune from the impact or the responsibility to respond. We're going to look at this specifically from the perspective of two artists. Alinah Azadeh is a visual artist, writer, performer, and cultural activist based in East Sussex. She uses text, audio, and live practices to create poetic narratives that activate spaces, amplifying untold or overlooked stories. Laura Buckle is an artist, researcher, educator, and activist based in Hampshire, whose practice focuses on the textile industry, in particular, textile waste. She recently completed the MA Art and Ecology at Goldsmiths. She was a finalist for the Platform Graduate Award 2021, which is managed by CVAN SE. So welcome to you both, Laura and Alinah. We're just going to start off by inviting you to talk about your journey into your practice and beginning to think about how it orientates in relation to this topic for today. And I'm really keen to get you to speak directly to each other and not just through me all the time. So please feel free to chip into each other as well. Alinah, would you perhaps like to start off, please?
Yes, so I had a sort of 25 years of working in visual arts connected to object making and installation work, performance, always using storytelling though in some way, and and very much using textile and text and narrative, and working with a strong social practice, sort of citing my work in spaces and reframing, kind of thinking about loss and change and identity. And in 2020, I'd started writing a lot about the work that I'd been making, and I was outside in the landscape, in the coastal landscape, and I came across, I was writing the final of a sort of chapter of a book that has been sort of around my practice, and I came across a line that was a Berlin Gap, which is a kind of right on the edge of the coast in the southeast, and it's 2053. It's right in the visitor centre, and it's the line. I asked what it was, and it's the line where the water would be coming to within the next 10 years or something. And it really wasn't very far from the edge of the cliff. And now, in fact, since that time, since 3 years ago, in fact, very recently, that centre is now closed, and the cafe that I was in has been moved, literally has been moved. And I started to write a story around my experiences of being someone of transcultural background. My mother arrived from Iran to live on the coast here, and a speculative story set in 2053. And that story sparked a project that has carried on since and through lockdown. And I thought at the time it was going to be a kind of performative piece or an installation piece for an interior work. And it turned into bringing me into the landscape, and the landscape becoming the museum, the gallery space for me, and it blossomed into a residency with the Southlands National Park and a residency along the coastal landscape. And so now I'm working and have been working on a program, a body of work with a group of other writers, artists of colour, developing a new body of work that will sit in the landscape all around loss and change and speculative futures for landscapes and for ourselves within those landscapes, and the interconnection between what's going on locally and how that connects globally through climate justice and those kinds of subjects. And so for me, that's my practice at the moment. It's outdoor and it's digital, and that has kind of that's all been very much intensely impacted by what's happened with the shift in my practice through COVID and everything else, but also just serendipitously thinking about, how do I respond to the dramatic changes that I see as I walk, because I walk a lot around that coast, and how can I bring that, how can I bring the metaphors of that coast to others, and how can I develop a kind of decolonial practice in a kind of collective way. So that's, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just going to bring Laura in now. So Laura, this few years sort of since the pandemic year in 2020 and so many other things that were sort of erupting at that time, that it's really been the time sort of leading up to your graduation of your first degree from Chichester and then going on to do your MA at Goldsmiths, and sort of forming your practice at sort of the early part of your career, starting off on your career. So I mean, these things must have had a lot of impact on your starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately, reflecting and looking back, as a working class artist, and considering sort of the impact of environment and on my community and how I approach making, is sort of deep rooted as far back as I can see. I got to university much later on, and fairly recently, and yeah, lockdown absolutely kind of reinforced my way of thinking in some respects, and in other ways sort of shaped the sort of trajectory of my work. I've always been working with textiles in some respects, but similar to Alinah, I think lockdowns made us go outside, and when you don't have studios, or you don't have access to studios, how do you continue your making? And I was just very lucky that my making was with materials that already existed, that I already had, that I could already get hold of, and placing them out into the environment. So similarly, that connection of land and people and our history and storytelling, it's just something I've continued on and will continue on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm interested if you see kind of Alinah, do you see kind of resonances in what Laura's saying about about the track that she's had through this?
Yeah, and it's interesting for me because before I kind of dematerialized my visual practice a little bit, if you like, into more using the landscape as the image and using text and audio and social practice in that way outdoors. I was working with textile, and I was working with recycled materials and with stories and with people, and I couldn't actually see a way of doing that outside of the walls of a gallery or museum. So it's really interesting seeing Laura's practice and how she's done that, in fact, because she's working with the idea of race and regenerative practice. And so for me, that it was really interesting to look at your work, Laura, and just kind of think about as well your ideas around time and how that impacts the materials in the space. Because I've been looking a lot through this, because it's the Chalk Coast, obviously, around deep time, and talking with archaeologists and looking at parallels between many millennia ago and now, and cycles of time. And I think yeah, looking at your work and how you also, like, I think you think in that way, trying to think like the landscape thinks, you know, trying to think about a different kind of time dimension to what we put into the spaces, and also our environment as an archive, and how we kind of read that, or it can be reinterpreted through different kinds of voices. And so I think we've kind of got that in common in a way, and thinking about class and race and gender, and the lenses through which we look at environment and our response to it, and who has the agency within that space, and how we get to it as well. And I think we both facilitate people a lot as well in outdoor space. So I think we've got that in common as well. It's very interesting as part of our practice.
So this, and I mean, right from the start, we're already in that kind of recognition that climate change doesn't act on its own. It's intertwined with class and all sorts of other kind of social context of the pandemic, of things like racism and post-colonial situation, and then also the economic conditions that artists are working in as well. So we've got to be conscious that it doesn't sort of stand on its own. It's all kind of there's a stickiness between all these different things and kind of attaching to each other and influencing each other. But if we try and zero in on climate change, which is so hard because it's so overwhelming and so big, but I mean, we had a bit of a pre-talk last week, and maybe one thing to start off with is I was interested that you were talking about the idea of trauma with climate change, and Laura, you had this wonderful phrase of a big heavy blanket kind of feeling of that. But give me a sense of that with from both of you. Maybe Laura, you go first, and then do leap in, Alinah. Just about I guess we're starting really very personally in your mind, sort of how heavily this looms psychologically, and how conscious you are of it in your everyday practice.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you know, the climate emergency, climate crisis is so heavy. It's a really kind of stressful well, it's stressful for all sorts of reasons, but certainly working as an artist, it's a really sort of stressful realm to be under that blanket. I said this to you before, and perhaps it's not sort of the best thing to share, but I'm not overtly positive about our climate crisis, the climate crisis, and actually, because it is so overwhelming, it's so scary, it's so stressful, sometimes unfathomable, that it's really hard to feel positive. However, my sort of the way in which I work or approach that kind of tackle that heavy subject is, once I've learnt something, perhaps it is an environmental injustice, or the way a materials were made, or the impact a material might have. Once I have that information, which as an artist we sort of can afford that time to research and digest, I can't sit and do nothing about it. I have to do something, whether that's stop all sort of participation in that particular thing, stop using that particular material, or I have to share this awful information that I found. And I think that is why I sort of work within this realm of art and ecology, is because I think so much of it is out there, but only for those that can afford the time to look and research. And artists, I think, quite often do have that time to consider these impacts and sometimes reimagine the future. you know, scientists, researchers are sort of very factual. They start at point A and have to get to point B, whereas an artist can kind of squiggle along that line and think of all sorts in the meantime. So yeah, it is a very heavy sort of blanket. But what I will say as well, there's kind of from my experience of working with other students, there is a narrative where there's a lot of mourning. I think a lot of our sort of artist history, there's a certain ignorance in the way they tackle certain things or certain materials, a blissful ignorance that I think a lot of students these days sort of are cross that they can't do that anymore, regardless of whether their entire practice is focused on a climate issue. They have to think about the materials that they're using, and there is sort of a mourning to a much freer way of making. I'm conscious of talking too much, Alinah, because I know we've spoken about this before. You have your say.
Oh no, it's good to carry on. But I take what you're saying in terms of mourning and loss, and also care. So if you're talking about being within this context of a trauma, and you know, how do you work with that? How do you kind of not fall into denial or you know, absolute despondency or or fear or rage, and for me it's kind of about care and connection, and also developing community around the work. And you know, I was probably privileged to get this residency around on the Seven Sisters and the coast, and it was very clear that I wanted to disrupt that idea of the solo artist or writer or creator in the landscape, and I wanted to bring other people along with me with whom I had a common kind of query, and that was how to make this English pastoral, idyllic, and yet very rapidly shifting space, you know, how to bring the trans-global perspectives, and that connects to the idea that we think, you know, we relate to the climate emergency as if it's sort of coming our way and it's here and it's kind of impacting some of us but not others, and for many people in the global south, and to whom, you know, the groups that I work with are connected through their heritage or our heritage, that has already happened. You know, there are already islands that have sunk or are sinking. There are, you know, in Iran they've already decimated, you know, so much of the wildlife. They're already imprisoning people for being constant. It's already kind of happening. And so when you kind of, and those stories, and if you look at shipwrecks along the south coast and what was brought on them, and some of the buildings, and you start to look at the slave wealth and the traces of those, and and that might sound kind of quite like devastating to look at, but actually when you start to give particularly the communities that I am part of and work with, a sense of like a kind of a narrative stake in the landscape, you open up a sense of belonging. And if you have belonging, then there's agency, and then then there's an opportunity to kind of care more and engage with a particular place. And, you know, caring about a particular place is a brilliant portal to kind of caring more widely about the environment. And I've got a lot from working in partnership with National Park. And I've learned a lot from them as well about just some of the ways, particularly the cultural heritage lead, who I work very closely, thinking in deep time, thinking globally, thinking about who first came here and how it was shaped and made. And so, you know, these historical traumas, the extraction, you know, that this island was involved with, and the things that we've been doing to ourselves, you know, since kind of industrial age, you know, they are traumas, but there's also opportunities to kind of hand over wider ownership to a broader community of people to kind of respond creatively. And I think that's where the kind of you know, when you get to the kind of more hopeful processes that you can engage with people.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, thinking about sort of that climate crisis within the arts, you know, really, as an industry, its response is quite slow. I mean, we're able to have amazing conversations like this, and I have just partaken in a really amazing master's degree, and so it's being recognized that, you know, this sort of realm of art and climate, but just hearing you talk now made me think about how in some respects there's sort of a pushback to the arts through climate, thinking about taking your work outside to the communities, this sort of non-conformative, you know, not necessarily just producing and constant making to display in a gallery or what have you, and working outside. I know for myself as a fairly recent graduate, the notion of not producing a physical thing was almost like, well, I'm not an artist if I don't do that. But actually, I think working in this sort of intertwined realm of whatever you want to call it, art and climate, art and ecology, it's allows or encourages the idea that we can be having conversations or going for a walk, and that is also considered art.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and also this idea of I think you touched upon that, around slowing down and refusing to align yourself with the fast turnover production cycles of institutions. I've learned that a lot from the park, from working in National Park, because obviously they think in very long term. You know, that they're talking about, you know, renaturing, rewilding. They think very far ahead, and are obviously constantly grappling with different versions of policies coming in and that kind of thing. But I think if we can learn from being in nature and of nature, for me also, it's also how do we get human beings, creatives, or anybody to think and to remember that we are of that, and also to create from that point of view. How do we decenter the human, in fact? And part of that is slowing down and also thinking permaculturally. So like, what can I grow around me? So for example, with me, the COVID, before I did a lot of my commissions and residencies were outside of the region. I'm mainly visible, in kind of other regions actually as a visual artist. And so I was suddenly stopped still, and then here I am, and what's around me. And for me, it's been actually about cultivating a sense of belonging, but also what can I grow over time? So when I started working with the National Park, the conversation was about, well, we love to do this project. I want you to grow it. What do you think? How do you think it should evolve? Asking me, and that's very unusual. Like we asked, and also we don't want it to be one project. We want to, how can we grow that over time and a longer term? How do you see? So, and I think institutions, visual artists can learn a lot from that. From the project turnover to kind of investment in artists, to artists leading as well the way and opening up more decentralized ways of working. And I think working with other sectors and in partnership with other sectors is really important part of that.
That's interesting. I do kind of think sometimes what our role is, speaking for the, saying we as in the visual arts sector, as artists or as curators or other people that work in the visual arts sector, I guess one thing is to be a great example, the best example you can be of how to work and how to live in this context, in your own carbon footprint, your own travel, your own use of energy and materials and resources. But I guess there's a more powerful role, there's a sort of a wider role for culture in how it helps the process of our thinking as the public, let's say, just and that that conversation can be it's quite a complex, sophisticated kind of conversation. It's not just flashing out great big shocking messages and bashing people over the head with it. I think it's far more subtle, isn't it? The way that you're entering into this, and also, and as you said, Alinah, it's participatory as well. It's trying to work with people and be orientated in a kind of collective sense. So is that our responsibility, is to is the connect, that connectedness, making connections. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I think there's still great value, and I personally, particularly as an older woman, need a lot of solitude and creative solitude, and to be alone, and to be alone with my thoughts and ideas, and to write and to develop work. But everything starts to make a lot more sense when, for me, when I draw on and I'm able to find a common ground with others who've had a kind of similar experience of what I would say has been a slightly disruptive experience of being person of mixed heritage in this country, particularly at this time, particularly through what's been going on since Brexit, for example. And so using the being in the landscape with people of mixed race, or Black and people of colour in particular, going through what happened with Black Lives Matter and how that was all brought to the fore, and just thinking about that just the act of walking and creating it as an act of solidarity and a political act, strangely, quietly radical act, for me, it's been like really kind of life-changing. And there's no way I could have produced the pieces of work. I've got 5 pieces of work that are going to be listenable in the landscape as part of this new piece commission that's coming out. No way I could have produced that work as one person on my own. It has involved conversations, walks and talks, research with many specialists, many other writers, artists like me, residents, campaigners, environment. It's been like, it's a whole kind of, like the thing about it takes a village to raise a child. It's like the same thing with, for me with an artwork. It's like it's just so many layers of relationships, and it's still for me. It's still actually a textile. It's still a textile process. It's still that interweaving of relationships and narratives. And then, at the moment for me, it's kind of recorded work and written work and performative work. But at some point it will assume probably a different form, whether that's film or whatever it will be. But so yeah, and I think that we need, and also for me that was a need, like it was a real need to be in connection, in conversation, in relationship, and to have that support, and to have those other perspectives on, who am I at this point in time in this place that's kind of disappearing, and and what does that mean to be a creative person at this time, and how do you make it work? How do you make it work?
And just thinking about our responsibility as a sector. And Laurie, you said that we've really been just incredibly slow, and even people that have got amazing, great intentions and really do care about it, actually putting that on the ground, it's just very there's just a huge delay, which there is in society, but also in the visual arts sector. But there are various schemes, like there's the Gallery Climate Coalition, which organised a fantastic conference at the Whitechapel last month called I think it's called Climate Change Artist Action. Someone would be able to Google that. And there's organisations like Julie's Bicycle and Culture Declares. There's a number of initiatives that are happening, but it still feels like a huge amount of change needs to happen, which is frustrating, I think. What can we say about the responsibility just all of us as individuals working in the sector, Laura?
I was going to say, you know, it is frustrating, and I would love, in fact, most of my friends and family will tell you, when I want to fix it, I want to fix it now. And I am very critical that some things are slow when they perhaps shouldn't be, but there is something really important about us taking our time to consider all. You know, there are so many environmental injustices, there are so many, yeah, like Alinah was saying, when you look at sort of our history as a climate, really, and thinking about the, you know, humans and more than humans, there is so much to consider. So when it comes to making certain decisions or implementing certain things, there is the possibility that if you're not careful, you're excluding certain people or impacting things that you hadn't considered. On the flip side, you don't want to take so much time trying to consider everything that you do nothing. There has to be some sort of action. So, you know, I suppose the answer is sort of like Alinah was saying, there's so much value in community, there is so much value in conversation, the mixing of different disciplines and conversations with different people is so vital, and that's the only way in my opinion that we're going to get anywhere, and in particular sort of in this realm of the arts. There are just conversations to be had. I think that's the most important thing that is perhaps just a bit too slow, is that the conversations aren't being facilitated quick enough. I don't know, what do you think, Alinah? That sounds a bit wishy-washy.
The conversations aren't being facilitated quick enough. Do you mean in the context of visual arts as a sector? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me because there having been a lockdown just at the point where I'd gotten an R&D, you know, Arts Council, and I'd thought about this piece, and maybe it was going to be a gallery piece, maybe it was going to be, and then it just became a piece of writing that I shared. And so I've had far more receptivity from the literature sector and the landscape sector than the visual arts sector, interestingly enough, even though I've had a very long career in the arts. And I don't know why, but in some sense, I've kind of gone towards the mediums that are more light-footed and maybe democratic, because they don't have to be, you know, commissioned into spaces or somehow. And so, you know, broadcast and all these are, for me, are artistic mediums anyway. They're all part of, as is the social practice. But you know, whatever's going on, within the sector, human beings are coming together. Like with the project that I've been doing, We See You Now. You know, whatever, many Zoom, even when it was lockdown, many Zoom groups right at the beginning. Much sharing of work, much emotional support, much you know, much kind of mutual aid, feedback on creative, you know, like becoming each other's editors, becoming each other's curators, all of that kind of feminist practice, in fact, around, you know, feminist leadership and sort of supporting groups to kind of and people to become mentors to each other, and to some extent I have found, you know, so maybe I'm curating work, but I'm also being helped by the people that I'm creating work for to help me to, you know, improve and evolve my own work. So I think a flattening of the hierarchies, which we can do as artists when we work and we develop communities around our work, it's quite hard within institutions. And so and there's a sense of having to lead in this, maybe in a certain way. And also we, you know, how do you decolonizing arts institutions is a whole thing in itself, and the structures that still persist and exist. And so it's bound to be very slow, but there are lots of, you know, I've of course come across people who really very much want to create change, but change can't just happen by what you program, but it happens institutionally. And I think that's a whole other conversation. But I think we just have to get on with work. And for me, you know, thinking about, I've been very privileged to get, you know, Arts Council funding, in fact, most of the way through the pandemic, and this project, because it's gone into the landscape and I've worked intersectionally and all that, has gotten support. But I do think this opening up, the migrating and between sectors and more collaboration, like the landscape and culture sector are not linked up in the way they could be. You know, when I came and started doing this project, one of the things I immediately said was it has to be about more than, say, my projects. There should be many projects like this. And I just introduced this brilliant grassroots organisation, Writing Our Legacy, to the national park, and they've been supporting me to developing this work. And now there's a blossoming of lots of activity. They're supportive, and they're an NPO, and you know, and they help me. And so you know, it's like you got to open the lift door for each other, right? Help each other. And so same with institutions. You know, if you recognise that someone, you know, has the capacity to, you know, show you the way and different way of working, like, yeah, just being open to that. I mean, I don't know. I'm just, that's just my experience of.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
Fluidly, you know, think about thinking more fluidly as nature thinks, right? As nature is, so can we follow that kind of way of evolving?
Do you mind if I just pause a minute to let the audience know a bit of information? We're really encouraging questions coming in. We've not had questions coming in yet, but it'd be really great to have any audience questions coming in. If you have any trouble with the YouTube chat with accessing that, we're also monitoring direct message on our Instagram. The Instagram handle is CVAN_SE for CVAN Southeast. I think that's lowercase, so it probably doesn't matter whether it's up or lowercase. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so that's so interesting. I had a thought the other day to try this out with you. There's so much talk in the news about green jobs, that the economy needs to shift to green jobs, and all the new kind of growth jobs, and the investment is going to be about green jobs. I don't think they're thinking about the visual arts sector, but I mean, should they be thinking? You know, should artist and curator be green jobs? And if they were, what would that? You know, are some people sort of carrying out those roles as green jobs at the moment, or what would need to? I think that would be a kind of interesting way to think, because I think people imagine that they're tech jobs, or they're jobs in conservation, or their jobs in, you know, changing the national grid, you know, power structure, so that we can draw our energy from different sources. I'm just really interested in a world where culture was sort of high on the agenda in the green jobs economy. Any thoughts on that?
Go on, I can see you.
Go ahead, Abby, please. I just spoke loads.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think I'm sure there are already people sort of facilitating in some ways. I think as long as, can you still see me? I'm pressing buttons. I think ultimately any job can kind of be greened in some respects, as like I was saying earlier, there's more consideration and conversation around various impacts on climate and social economic things. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think, Alinah, on a greener job.
I guess I don't know. I think it's hard to respond to that, really. I guess there's a difference between what you do and how you're, the kind of philosophical way that you approach your work. There's a, you know, there's obviously there's a lot around, you know, you know, anti-waste and regenerative and circular economy and all the kind of buzzwords and the practices and adopting certain policies and I always look to how are people treating other human beings within that system. So, you know, it's not just about the sort of approach to material processes or it's actually how human beings being treated. And so that's often my measure of what I would see to be green, because that's about care based. Yeah.
I think there's there, perhaps I'm struggling to answer because there's some sort of skepticism in sort of the notion of it. And you know, you talking about sort of circular economy, the minute you make something kind of industry practice, there are so many ways in which things get sort of hidden in certain policies and under certain words, and actually it's not a very proactive thing anymore. Suddenly it's, you adhere to a policy, for example, and that's a greener way of doing things. But like the climate, like nature, things evolve and change, and if you're not sort of proactively you know, considering those kind of things, then I'd be slightly, I'm slightly skeptical, I think.
Because of the brand, because it's kind of a brand in some sense. It's been co-opted in that way. But isn't it about how we what's being, I mean, I'm just more philosophical about it, I suppose, because, you know, what's being grown and what are people aspiring to when they come into that, when you start thinking about that, what are you kind of aspiring to with your green job? What is it? What are you trying to do? Like, I think we're just a few steps ahead of where we should be, which is like, what's all this for? You know.
I guess it's quite an instrumental model, isn't it? Of sort of as if you can sort of press certain buttons and get a direct change, you know. And it's a very capitalist model of growth. It's sort of like shifting it onto that. Trying to make that model of the economy solve a problem, and it seems like the world that you're both envisaging is much more about communities and making sure that everyone's included in that, because I guess that more competitive model means that some people will inevitably lose out, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, inclusion is a big thing. I know, for example, working in landscape, the whole kind of basis of what we've been doing is really looking at who got to tell the stories about the landscape, you know, the iconic landscape of the Sussex Downs and Seven Sisters, and, you know, what stories weren't being told, and how do we bring people to that space, to access it, to feel invested in it in order to be able to tell new stories. And that in itself was a huge thing. And actually, you know, I was lucky because, you know, the partner of the National Park, you know, will put the resources in to enable that to happen, and that's quite unusual, I think, but that's been a long process. And so it's the same with bringing people into galleries, like, you know, who is this for, and what, you know, who gets to own the space, and you know, and what are they doing with it, and to what purpose. And so I just think there's lots of questions to ask about who owns the space and why, and do people really want to share that space? You know, how do you make more space for different kinds of stories and voices and people to feel ownership of, you know, within those spaces, so that they can actually then create different kinds of work that reimagine, like we're talking about speculative, you know, our project is all around speculative fiction and thinking, and, you know, thinking beyond the now, for example. And I think that's what, you know, sorry, God, Laura, that's the way that you work a lot as well, isn't it? Reimagining, because that's a very powerful tool. You know, it's very easy to argue about the past and panic about the present, but actually reimagining the future is a really empowering way of working. And I think that's, as a sector as well, that's what needs to, I mean, I think it is happening, but and particularly actually in in spaces that are given over or led by people of colour, in fact, because it comes from a long tradition of speculative thinking comes from that lot of the traditions. So yeah, so I'm slightly going off on a tangent there.
I wonder, we're into the last sort of 15 minutes or so. I'm interested as well. I think we probably touched on it already, about the changes in thinking about practices that are to do with materials. So I know that Laura's done work that's intentionally intended to disappear into the physically into the earth, into the ground. It's not sort of thinking about permanence in an artwork. I guess documenting something as a sort of performance of letting it fade into the earth. And you're using text a lot in your work, the word as well, Alinah. So there's something about dematerialization and art disappearing, which has a bigger sort of philosophical position about what art is. There's some thoughts about that. Do you think there'll be more of those kind of practices that are that don't go into collections as physical items that maybe are more their permanence is as documentation?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I think when you think of our sort of, as Alinah says, colonial history and this idea of keeping and storing and categorizing, thinking about museums, and some galleries and collections perhaps are not too far behind that sort of narrative. I think not producing something physically that lasts forever is probably quite important for some people. And I think that ultimately, the longevity of your work or the longevity of a project doesn't just have to reside in a physical object. And thinking, about my sculpture that, as you said, disappears into the earth. That is sort of a project that has spanned across a couple of years now, even though the physical thing doesn't exist anymore, not really. And so opening up this idea that art can be physical, it can be conversational, it can be community led. That is something I think moving forward, younger artists or new generations of artists will hopefully consider. And I think back to when I first started my undergrad, and the walking around the studios, and everything was kind of brand new, and the product, the materials were really kind of, everyone was obsessed with resin. I don't know why, but when I first started, everyone was obsessed with making things with resin, which is so expensive anyway. And I think shifting that mentality of what role an artist can play, and talking about history and interconnecting different sectors and spiritual histories and all sorts, I think is something that moving forward I feel is inevitable, or this is where my sort of only bit of optimism comes in. I hope is the trajectory of the arts, because I mean, my God, we have to do something.
Yeah. I mean, there's a history there already, isn't there, of that kind of practice, but it's alongside other kinds of practice that are incredibly extractive of resources from the earth. It's hard to say that that's a trend, maybe, but it's I mean, I guess that's if these are if this is an issue that you really want to address, then you've got to be thinking about materials, haven't you, as well? that you're using to do that. What are your thoughts on that, Alinah?
Yeah, this idea of not leaving no trace, creating no waste or work decomposing. And, I've been through that with some of my previous projects before I was doing this one in the landscape. Much to the horror of one curator who was like, you can't burn it all. It's too beautiful. It's like, okay, that was difficult. But it's difficult because it's at odds with, although not exclusively, with the like you say, the idea of collecting and product and that. But then people manage to collect performances, and that's happened. You know what I mean? So there are ways of doing that. And that. But it is tricky. But then on the other hand, there's the idea of legacy, that one still wants to obviously leave a legacy. Maybe that legacy, yes, might be a legacy that is remains in an image, or in a series of relationships, or in a new initiative that happens in a different sector. Or so maybe we need to think about legacy in a slightly different way. I think we're lucky because we have the digital. The project that we're trying to put into the landscape is a kind of 5-year, we'll know about funding soon, but 5-year series of listening points that you'll pick up with your phone, for example, and also online. But I remember talking to someone about the timeline of that legacy was up to 5 years, but really the only way you could ever really have an absolute legacy with nothing would be to carve it in stone, really. I mean, so you sort of start thinking, and also if something goes up, if it all gets brought down and there's nothing, so ultimately it's like some things are beyond our control. And I think it's really important to think of low harm ways of producing work. And for me, that relational and storytelling and the creation of new myths and stories is a big one for me, and how you embed that in people's minds and hearts and all of that is a kind of is one that I'm kind of thinking about, and how that can be generative as well. How you can generate, how you can invite other people to then respond and make work, and that in itself, it's like how you can work transgenerationally. How can stories that I put into the landscape now inspire the next younger generations, for example, and what form would they take, what form would their creations take in response to that work. So I think we kind of have to think in that way, to think ahead in that way, even if we do feel not very optimistic about what's coming, but still it's really important to live as if, otherwise.
And I think ultimately, thinking about students or artists that are considering certain things in their practice to do with climate, and perhaps they are thinking of these really big things as we do, or perhaps they are just thinking about sort of the impact of their materials. There's sort of a baseline really here, that as an artist, as a maker, as a creative, we do have a certain amount of responsibility. And if your thing is not climate, or thinking about how doomed we are every day, then that's totally fine. But it is important to consider materials in your practice, and maybe that the final outcome is still something that doesn't appear directly connected to climate. But I think as long as your sort of thought process and the conversations you're having are gearing towards that bigger picture, there's that really cheesy saying, isn't there? Is it think global, act local, or whatever it is? As long as you're thinking about impacts, then it'll filter into your work somehow. And if I'm in any sort of position to give advice, I would just say that there is a certain amount of work that goes into being reflective and silence and being calm, and if it is too doom and gloom, there is utmost importance in just taking time and sitting back and just resting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rest as resistance, and that one of the artists that I work with, Akila Richards, works very much with rest as resistance, and I've learned a lot from her. And we walked very, very slowly often and in silence, and then we sat and wrote, and we listened to the landscape. And there's just nothing like learning from nature, different ways of being and creating. You know, it doesn't even take, you don't even spend very long there for it to kind of change your way of thinking, or studio practice, for example. So I know I'd really agree with that. And also the Thich Nhat Hanh, I don't know if you know that one about, you know, too much, what was it? Too many things to do, too much, you know, too many, what is it? So much, it was something like, you know, too many things going on, too much to do, I must go slow. And so it's it's countercultural in the kind of panic emergency, everything's, but it's actually what's required, because actually a burnt out artist is no good to anybody, as I have experienced myself.
I'm going to come in. We've got an audience question, and we only have about 3 minutes left, so it's going to be 30-second answers only, I think, probably. The question is, do you think that since the rise of NFTs, it's easier to get people on board with the idea of art that isn't permanent?
Ooh. I'm an absolute technophobe, I will say, but I think yes, there is a sort of there is a shift or a switch in you know, moving from physical to digital that absolutely is changing certain mindsets, with probably great help from COVID, like shifting everything online. So yeah, I think it's, but then, you know, things like technology, I could go into it. I don't have, if I've only got 30 seconds, I'll let Alinah answer.
I think the jury's out
to say
about
that it's not green.
Yeah.
It's not the amount of energy it takes to produce. Is that what
the cloud has a carbon footprint,
Exactly.
doesn't it? And actually the carbon, I'm less concerned about the carbon footprint of NFTs, and just the sort of junk that's on your phone has a carbon footprint. And maybe the jury's out about the value of NFTs as art objects and where they are. I mean, I know that you know, they have appeared in auctions and things, but I think it's still at very, very early days. Do you think, Alinah?
Yeah, I mean, people are probably at this end of the, you know, the late capitalist era, doing anything they can to commodify anything. And so that's fair enough, that's going to happen, but you know, often that gets disrupted, like AI is going to disrupt, you know, that and all of that, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the lack of permanent, I mean, art being not permanent, but just existing as a recording, I mean, that's what music does, isn't it? That's, yeah, there's not a big audience problem with understanding that, I don't think, and it's what movies do as well.
That's true.
And that plays into the longevity of things. Once the physical thing or the movie's over or the song's over, it stays with somebody, and it's how you have those conversations within communities and pass on and continue that legacy of that might no longer exist.
Okay, I think there we must end. I'm going to be kind of strict with our hour. You've both been amazing. Thank you so much, and really look forward to seeing where you both go forward, with a small carbon footprint and a great impact, I hope. Yeah, thank you both. Thank you. I think we need to mute now. Thank you very much.